find a way to get everybody to stop talking. Hello always works. My name is Kismet Tension. This is my classmate Dan Rowe and our professor, our amazing professor, Dr. Susan Raines. And today we're just going to share with you about our recent experience to Cuba. We went, about a month ago.
November 3rd through 10th.
Yes.
Yeah,
So not even a month. Yeah. And it was an amazing experience. So we're just going to kind of walk you through a few of the things that kind of stood out to us, and then, you know, give you a chance to kind of ask questions afterwards. So,
cool. So these slides aren't chronologically in order as far as our trip goes, but I thought it was kind of useful to put this first slide where it was. This is Las Terrasas, which is this. It's out in the countryside, and it's this biosphere reserve, I guess is the best way to say it, which is a really unique thing, and I don't know that we have a big frame of reference for it here, but it's this sort of community, and it's a self-contained community of artists out on the hillsides. They grow coffee out there. They have, they have their own clinic. They have everything, and it's gorgeous. But the one thing that the reason I kind of wanted to start with this one was the idea of these self-contained communities, and the idea of artists and sort of artist communities being really pervasive the whole time we were in Cuba. And you'll see a few other slides and a few other areas where that comes up. But it was everywhere, every country you go to is going to have art. Everywhere you're going to go is going to have some kind of art. But it was everywhere. It was infused in everything in some way in Cuba, which was kind of an interesting approach. I don't know, you get anything for that?
No.
One? Okay, cool. There we go. So this is actually, on the subject of the countryside, this is Viñales. And I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about Viñales.
Yeah, it was beautiful. So this was my second time going to Cuba, and at first, the first time I went on a cruise. This was maybe a couple years ago when you were actually allowed to cruise to Cuba before things changed with our current administration. And so I remember the first time I went to Cuba, it felt very odd to be there as a tourist, and to really. So I was really trying to enjoy myself, but on that trip, I don't know if I was projecting something, or I just didn't get this warm welcome to Cuba feeling. And yet again, I don't know if it was because I came off the cruise ship and they were just kind of looking at us. Maybe a little offended, because some people that were on the ship were getting off and taking pictures of them like they weren't human. And so I don't know if they were just kind of over that experience. So my goal with coming this time was like, let me just really go and come with a completely different mindset and see if I have a completely different experience, which I did. And so this was our third day going. It was maybe like a 2 hour.
It's 3 hours. Yeah, it's out in it's in a different state in Cuba. It's in Pinar del Rio, which is way out in the west. But that's where a huge agricultural base out there.
Yeah, and it was almost, I don't even know how to describe it. It was just almost like this whole separate, like we started the first couple days off in Havana. And so Havana is everything you've seen in pictures with the art and the cigars and everything that you see commercially. Havana is that. And then you get here and it's completely different. Like the people seem completely different. The housing, like everything was like a completely different experience. It almost felt like time stopped. It's like if you grew up in the city and then all of a sudden you go to the country for the weekend and you're like, nobody's moving, everything's going in slow motion. That's kind of how it felt when we got here. So it kind of allowed us to kind of calm down and really just settle in a little bit and just really, I don't know, get to know the people. We stayed in homes.
Yeah, so a lot of places, Americans particularly, stay in Cuba, but a lot of places anybody stays. A lot of the tourism industry has popped up around staying like. There are hotels in Havana and stuff, but particularly as you get out this way, it's a lot of private homes. Most of the private homes, if people are pretty established, they'll have an extra room, 2 rooms, what have you, where they're renting space, and there's a little symbol on all the houses that can tell you that they're renting space for rooms and for visitors. And so this whole area, Viñales, has turned into this. It's a tourist hub, but it doesn't feel that way. It's people are sort of moving at the pace of what's going on out there. So there's people from all over the world out there, just living in the country, riding horses, eating breakfast on a rooftop, that type of stuff.
Yeah, we call it the Tuscany. I call it the Tuscany of Cuba. So it's a World Heritage Site just because it's so beautiful, and it's where they grow some tobacco. It's not the main tobacco growing region, but you are able to kind of visit tobacco farms and see the process of creating tobacco for Cuban cigars, which are very famous. But it's a lot of outdoor activities that they have there, of course, year round because of the climate. So there's horseback riding and zip lining and hiking, and there's a boat you can take through a cave that we did. So a lot of interesting outdoor activities. And it's also a way that visitors can help infuse the economy outside of Havana with some needed cash, because it's mostly an agricultural economy. And you will still see kind of horses and carts and oxes and things like that, and not a lot of tractors or farm equipment because they can't get the parts, because there's an embargo, I don't know if you've heard, against Cuba. By the U.S., but they struggle to get the parts, and they struggle to get the oil and the gasoline and other things. So they still use very low-tech methods for agriculture. And the benefit of that is actually people live a long time because, I joke, they can't afford pesticides. So they have, by accident, they have organic food, right? So it's very kind of low-tech farming, but lovely, wonderful, healthy food as a result.
And you can see how natural this looks, but I actually found out from somebody who'd been visiting this area, for decades and had been there 20, 30 years earlier, all these little houses, just these tiny little bits of development that you can see from this view, none of that was there 20, 30 years ago. This was all just farmland and forest. And the thing that Vinales is really known for is this is where those caves are that Dr. Raines was talking about, these huge limestone. They're not really mountains. There was a specific name for them, but yeah, they're these massive rock formations, and it's kind of creates an interesting climate. It's a little bit cooler in the evening there. It's a little bit, you catch a little more of the breeze during the day. It's nice.
And that was taken from someone's room, right? Was that your room? This view?
I want to say that was the restaurant, because of how far we are from the rocks.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
I'll mention we also, go ahead and go to the next slide, but we also, while we were there, for $5, we went to this wonderful restaurant, but for $5 we had the option of taking a cooking lesson. So we got to see how they make a lot of the traditional dishes firsthand with a cooking lesson, which was fun.
So I'm gonna take credit for this slide. I made this one, and I did because I thought we had a very interesting interaction when we went to the embassy in Cuba. As you can imagine, with U.S. relations with Cuba, whatever you may or may not know about those, there's some tension. So there is it's a unique position for an embassy to be in. And before I say what I say, I want to give credit to the person who we did talk to. He was a real good sport about the whole thing, and we really appreciated all of his input. But he came out with some slides and really started kind of our guide, the Dr. Raines' friend down in Cuba, Ray. He's a lawyer. He teaches classes. He's a really intelligent guy. We weren't getting touristy tours. We were getting high level kind of academic tours. So we got a lot of information from him before we made it over to the embassy. And this representative from the embassy really he started coming out with the party line about Cuba and how miserable the people were, and how hard the government had been, and really just why it made so much sense that we had this embargo, and really there's no other way for it to be, and it took about 5 minutes before we really started pushing back against that, and we asked him questions, and he engaged. He didn't completely shut down. He didn't ever show any kind of bad humor. Yeah, I feel like he appreciated a little bit of a challenge, but about 45 minutes in, he did, and that's where my caption comes from. He did kind of have to break down and say that because of his position, he had to explain the policy as it stands currently. That's what he had. He didn't have anything else. If it was a different administration, if there was different rules, if it was different relations, he'd explain that, and he would have justifications for that. But I thought we did the conflict management program proud. I thought we did graduate programs at Kennesaw proud by kind of getting into it with him and mixing it up a little bit.
I'll add, is anybody here thinking about a career in the Foreign Service? Being a diplomat? Okay, so first of all, he was really happy to hear that some of our students were interested in that. All of our students were graduate students, some PhD, and then mostly master students. Because they're hiring like crazy because so many have quit. So the good news is now, and I tell my students this, now is a really great time to take the Foreign Service Officer exam. If you pass it, get into the Foreign Service because by the time you get trained, policies and administrations change all the time. But what was interesting is, and I don't know, y'all may be coming from different backgrounds or different classes, so I don't know how much you know about Cuba, but the U.S. has an embargo against Cuba. And because of that, and different presidents have kind of had more opening toward Cuba on trade and tourism and relations, and other presidents have had a preference to close relationships with Cuba, to kind of punish them for some things that happened during the revolution with the Castros. So Obama's approach was that opening Cuba to contact would help them see what the future might hold for them if they had kind of political reform, economic reform. They could be welcomed into the world of nation states and benefit from that. So there was some opening under the Obama administration. Under the Trump administration, the opposite has happened. So they had a couple of years where tourism really boomed in 2016, 2017 under Obama, and then it has really, American tourism, and then it has really crashed since then. And so there's, interestingly, we asked this, it is the job of a State Department person, and a diplomat, to explain the official U.S. policy and the logic behind it. So he's giving us the reason for the official policy under the Trump administration. The law hasn't changed, the embargo law hasn't changed, but how it's interpreted by each president has changed pretty drastically. So I asked him, I said, okay, imagine we put you in a time machine and we put you back to 2016 or 2015 and we asked you to explain that policy, what would you say? And he's like, I would tell you the rationale for the policy, just like I'm telling you the rationale for the policy, but I can't discuss domestic politics. So as a diplomat, he's not allowed to really discuss the American domestic political situation and how that's affecting our relationship with Cuba. He's only allowed to kind of, by script, repeat what the U.S. official position is toward Cuba. I've been going to Cuba since 2011, and I've gone 7 times since then, including being there on some election nights for the U.S. presidential election, so I got to see how they reacted to our elections, and that was interesting. But I've seen 3 different State Department officials explain U.S. policy toward Cuba from between 2015 and now. So it is interesting, and some of them are kind of more apolitical, and some of them are very political. So it's interesting how they kind of deal with that. But it's also interesting, Cuba is one of the postings that traditionally members of the U.S. State Department have really wanted to go to. You don't always want to go to Kazakhstan or, metaphorical Timbuktu. You want to go somewhere like Paris or London or Rome. But Cuba was up there because it's close to the States. It's very, very safe. It has a wonderful climate. It has good public health. If you get sick and need the hospital, you'd rather be in Cuba than in Cameroon maybe, right? So a lot of good things going for it. But Cuba is one of the countries where the U.S. State Department has a rule that there cannot be any interpersonal relationships between a U.S. diplomat and local people. So you can't date local people. You can't have best friends with local people because they're worried that that person could be a spy, right? Or otherwise spy upon you. So in previous trips to the embassy, I've actually had the official, because sometimes it's something they call the charge d'affaires or the ambassador, actually ask us, what are you hearing from Cubans? What are they happy? What's going on? What are Cubans like? Because they literally spend their day and their off hours with other diplomats from other countries, interacting with very few Cubans. So we had mentioned this really, there's a huge food scene in Cuba. You wouldn't know this, but if you're a foodie, you like to watch like food chef, competitions and stuff. Cuba is huge in the foodie community, with lots of individually owned family restaurants that have become very, swanky to not swanky, everything in between, but very robust food scene. And I had mentioned to him, oh yes, we went to this restaurant that all of Havana's talking about, it's the place to be. He had acted like he had no idea what we were talking about, because he doesn't go and kind of mix with regular Cubans because of this kind of political concern to keep some distance. So I thought that was an interesting just an interesting observation. But it is a great place. The embassy's currently closed. The Trump administration has closed the embassy, which was reopened under Obama. Now it's closed again. One can assume that eventually, and it tends to be, right, not getting partisan, but Republicans are in favor of a bigger embargo, and Democrats are in favor of less in favor of an embargo. So we can assume it may swing back and forth, and the embassy may be restaffed at some point in the future. But for now, there's just a skeleton staff, and they're not giving visas for Cubans to come to the U.S. very easily. They don't have any visa appointments at that embassy. And there's not very many staff at the embassy, so it's kind of a skeleton crew. It was a very quiet building when we were there, which is why they had so much time to spend with us for the first time. Usually they rush us in and out. They really had nothing to do, so it was kind of nice, or very little to do.
It's a little eerie too, because all the other embassies, I got a chance to do a little driving around with somebody that knew the area, and all the other embassies are in this really beautiful old part of town for like pre-revolution, all these old houses, and you got like the Chinese and the Ghanaian and the Korean embassies, and they're all next to each other in these like old houses from the 40s. They're all these really vibrant colors. They've been kept up to date really well. And the U.S. Embassy is just this staunch stone and glass brown building just out on this like kind of coastal area, and it just overlooks nothing, and it's next to really nothing. And
It almost looks Soviet, you know what I mean?
It really does.
Just very plain, yeah.
But it was kind of weird it being so quiet and looking like that. The art again. So this is a place called Morleando, and this is a whole neighborhood that used to be kind of a refuse area, this dump, landfill, if you will, it was one particular artist, but a bunch of friends kind of got together, and the whole neighborhood reclaimed this section, and they turned it in, and this is just one tiny little snapshot of what is like a whole 2 or 3 blocks worth of like these mosaics and murals and sculptures, and they've turned this whole neighborhood into a work of art, and it's not uncommon. There's another place called Fusterlandia, which is a little bit further away, that is a very similar situation, and like the Las Terrasas, the artists are alive and vibrant and very common and really active in Cuba in a way that I've been a few places, and it's pretty unique.
And it's one of the areas that the public, that the private sector can take over. So you're allowed to be an artist and sell your art, but most people work for the government and they have an official government job. So even if you work in a hotel, you work for the government. If you work, the only kind of industries that are now not owned by the government are really tourism. Some of it is privatized. Restaurants, some of them are privatized, not all of them. And then artists, there's certain sectors of the economy, some taxi drivers. So there's certain sectors where they've allowed people to kind of pursue capitalism, and art is one of them. So that might be why it already was culturally an important part of the Cuban culture. But I think in the need to everybody has a side hustle in Cuba. You have like your government job, but then you need to do something to make real money on the side. So if you can be a musician and play at a restaurant and get tips, or you can be an artist of various kinds. So you see kind of a lot of people using art as kind of their way to make some income on the side. But that, you can't tell that is a water tank that was filled with trash, and they cleaned it out and turned it into a community center for art. We have art classes. They have special classes for disabled children, special needs children, as well as other kinds of art for the community. And they have like a party space with a band, and they hold community events and quinceañeras and all kinds of things. And it's become something I think we could learn from here in the U.S. as a way to kind of take a community that was more impoverished than the ones around it, and find an economic driver, because now people come there specifically to visit this area. It brings in tourism, it brings in people to go to restaurants, and all kinds of things. So it has a good multiplier effect. Dan?
Quick announcement, as a reminder, there's an incredible
Yes.
Cuban art exhibit 1 floor up in this building. So if you haven't seen it yet,
Yeah.
it'll be up through the end of the month, but it's fantastic. There's about 80 different Cuban artists and their artwork represented upstairs.
I should mention there's also, y'all had a presentation on the independent media in Cuba, and I would mention, as a socialist country and a one-party state, freedom of speech is not the same there as it is here. It's not as bad as Americans think it is, but it's still not the same as it is here. However, art and artists have been given more latitude. So there's Cuban songs where the singer sings in metaphor about what's good or bad about the country, but they use metaphors. Or there's art. One of the art displays we saw was keys, like an actual key, lock and key, and they put them all together to form like a mosaic of the country of Cuba as an analogy to say it's really hard to get out. We don't have a key to get out and in easily, right? We're kind of, sometimes we feel trapped. So there's art as a way that kind of political expression has taken root and been free within reason. It doesn't mean an artist can do anything and get away with anything, but they're a little bit freer than others in some ways.
One of the things I wanted to say too, is Dr. Ains brought up a point about in Morleando, they teach, particularly what stuck out to me was they teach special needs adults these art classes, and community service overlaps with art in a big way in a lot of these places that you see sometimes here. Like obviously there's people with, that are creative and also driven to serve in some way, but it's almost like a model. Like if you're doing this, then you may also be doing this. It's pretty likely. And they a lot community service in a lot of ways. It's interesting. I don't want to waste anybody's time, but I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it. I feel bad.
No, go ahead, because I don't even remember why we even took this picture. It was just in the middle of the courtyard.
Oh, I love her. Oh, she's great. No, so this is an art installation this guy did in 2012. Didn't say anything about it, but a lot of people have sort of settled on a conclusion about it, which is what Ray told us. And it's this metaphor about the special period during the 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed, because Cuba relied on the Soviet Union, and when they collapsed, or when they folded, closed up shop, however you want to phrase that, Cuba was really in dire straits for a little bit. They were scrambling to find somewhere else to get income. So people, austerity is a really nice word for it, but people were melting down shoes to make spoons. People were refashioning glasses with gear grinders and stuff. Like it was things got pretty lean for a little bit. But there's the idea behind the statue. If you look closely, you can see she's got high heels on. And the whole idea of a rooster and the pride and things like that. There's this idea of dignity and grace, even in the face of really insurmountable struggle. And for a period of time, Cuba addressed it. Started opening up private businesses, and it is not like that anymore. You may talk to people who kind of have old news, and they still think that's what's going on. It is very much not.
There is a concern, though, because currently Venezuela has kind of taken over in some way the role that the Soviet Union had before. So Venezuela, which has more oil than Saudi Arabia, for example, it has a lot of rich natural resources. And so it has been giving oil to Cuba, and Cuba exports doctors and nurses. They have a great educational system. So they educate healthcare workers. They send them abroad and exchange their labor for other things, resources like oil or cash or other things. So this is the first time I've been to Cuba where there were really long lines for fuel, because if you've seen the news, Venezuela is on the verge of collapse. And as a result, Cubans are very concerned that if Venezuela collapses, their own currency could become worth less. And they will have food shortages. They're already having shortages of certain items that I've never seen before them have a shortage of. So they don't have as much money to buy imported goods, the government. So it'll be interesting to see if they go through, again, another period of difficulty if Venezuela isn't able to continue to help trade with them the way they have been in the past.
Yeah, and so this was the Martin Luther King Center, which we're kind of surprised that they actually honor Martin Luther King in Cuba. But when we asked them, why did you choose Martin Luther King, they felt like they believed in his commitment to service, and that's kind of what they wanted to be known as well. And this was, I don't remember, it was one of the poorest communities in Havana. That is, everything's pretty much run by this community center. So all their donations and everything is just really for that community. There were senior citizens who we had an amazing time hanging out with that actually come and serve, and just everyone has the spirit of giving back. And I can't.
They did they did soup kitchens. They would do like meal kitchens on weekends.
Yeah,
They would do
classes.
community events, classes, like civic engagement classes for the community and
Senior exercise classes.
yeah, and when she says senior citizens, we're talking like these ladies were like
Oh,
85,
yes.
90, like, and they were alive. They were dancing. They were doing all kinds of stuff. They were pulling us out of our chairs. Like these, and not a single one of them over 5 foot tall. They were awesome.
And they were happy, like they
Yeah.
were really
Yeah.
happy. Because you tend to think sometimes when you're just in such a community of need that there's just not happiness, but they were so happy. They're like, we alive, we can walk, we can move, we can dance. Like they were bragging, like, look, I'm 80 and I can dance like this. We were like, oh, okay, like challenging us, like to get up, dance, like join us, and we did. I think we had a really great time just dancing with them, and they really made sure we felt connected.
And if I remember right, they were talking about like it's not just senior citizen classes and it's like, oh, they're over here and we're serving them. They're engaged in the operations of the center itself, and they're helping run these meal kitchens. They're helping run these events. This is a way that they've retired. They've raised their families, and now they're in their community. They're elbow deep in the community
And tutoring.
and tutoring. Yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
So that there aren't like nursing homes or elder facilities or 55 and adult communities, in Cuba, so the elders stay with their families and stay in the community, and they contribute. So the fact that you're maybe retired doesn't mean you're not contributing, because that means that you live in a multi-generational household, and the adults that are working age have kids, and so the elders are the ones cooking and cleaning and helping with childcare and that kind of stuff. So they're still very much an important part of the family and the community. It's not a sedentary retirement, but they have significantly longer life expectancy than we do. They have very good health care and they have very good life expectancy. So it's working for them.
Well, what they were telling us too is they opened up the Martin Luther King Center. They wanted to use his name. It was a Baptist church that was connected to it, that was associated with it, but they wanted to draw on his ideas of community service and civic engagement, and so that's where a lot of that basis came from, because they opened during a time when not only are they just generally one of the poorer areas, but it was also a kind of a rough time overall. And a lot of the classes that they teach and things like that are sort of follow the same trajectory that a lot of Dr. King's lessons did. So it was really interesting. And the food. Everybody wants to know about the food. Everyone wants to talk about food.
Raise your hand if you're one of the students that are going to Cuba in the spring. Do we have any of those students here? Okay. Yay. Yeah. Everybody likes Cuban food. I mean, you know how, like me personally, I'm not wild about Cajun food, and not everybody likes sushi. Everybody likes Cuban food. Ain't nothing not to like. Yeah.
There's also Cuban food, objectively awesome, but the creativity, the chefs, she was talking about the chefs there, it's not standard Cuban fare, like you go to a Cuban restaurant here at every single place. Like the chefs have really, it's almost as competition, like one place to another. How creatively can you present? How can you mix these ingredients that everybody's had? How can you, because it's all these places are serving some of the standards, some of the pork, some of the ropa vieja, some of the stuff. But then as you go place to place, and some of these pictures show it a little bit here. This place had some of the best food that I had in Havana, but they're doing all kinds of stuff. It's wild. They're I would say on par with any other food city that you'd see around the world, in documentaries or shows or whatever.
And they're often in these like really amazing old houses that have been converted into a restaurant. So it's often very interesting. And for example, you might be able to get a lobster dinner for less than $15. You can go to an expensive restaurant that's mostly for Westerners and pay more, but there's a lot of local food that's not expensive at all. Okay.
Well, this is
Okay.
where my slides end.
Will you pull up the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, so we just have a bank where people dump their pictures, so you can see some of the pictures, and then we'll take question and answers. From a cultural perspective, a couple of things I would say, having been there from 2011 till now. I'm not a Cuban expert. There's other countries I go to just as much, but I would say the changes I've seen in that period of time are pretty amazing. So, for example, when I first was going there, Cubans were not allowed to buy and sell their homes. Can you imagine? So what would happen was, if you got a job across town and now your home was not convenient for you, on Saturdays there was literally like a pedestrian mall where people would hold up a sign that would say something like 2-bedroom and here's the address, and I'm seeking a 2-bedroom in this other address or this other area, part of town. And people would literally swap, but they couldn't sell it. So that law has been changed. People can, because of that, by the way, no one was building a new home. Why would you build a home you could not sell, right? So there was a huge housing shortage, and they lost a whole 2 generations of people who know how to build. And this was during our recession, and I thought, my God, you know how many unemployed contractors there are in Georgia that I wish we could just send down here, you know, because they were ready to build once they changed that law, but they'd lost the knowledge of how to build. But that has changed now. You see also hotels going up. So the U.S. is the only country that has an embargo against Cuba. So there are Spanish-owned hotels, Canadian hotels, there are Mexican hotels, there are British hotels. There just are not American hotels. So there's lots of others who trade with Cuba. So some other changes I've seen, for example, you used to have to do dial-up internet from like the big international hotels would have like an internet cafe place that you could pay by the hour and use internet, and it was so slow that we could barely even check email while we were visiting. Now, if a Cuban has enough money to afford it, they can get internet on their phone, GPS on their phone, they can watch Netflix on their phone, bootleg Netflix. But in the end, they can do it. So in the last year, internet access got open to the whole island, some of which is quite rural. So they actually probably have better access than some of our Appalachian folks, right? There's places in this country where you don't have good internet access at all in very rural areas. But the government wanted to make sure that once it became available to everybody. There is a fee for it, obviously. Interestingly, certain things are illegal in Cuba, and they are very severely penalized. So, for example, pornography is illegal in Cuba, and they consider it to be something that is a negative aspect of capitalism. Buying and selling people is not something that their country, or any aspect of that, is not something that they support. And I asked, well, how will you keep pornography out now that you have the internet? And they really haven't completely figured all this out yet. But they know that if you get caught with pornography on your computer, you could spend a long time in jail. When I asked about the concept of even child pornography, I had to explain what I meant. Because they go, what are you talking about? I had to explain what it was. And they're like, oh my God, no, that's not a thing here. It hasn't been a thing here that anybody knows about because they haven't had the internet. So they're going to have the goal as they open up to the West and to the world is to how do you keep the good stuff that they have, but keep out the bad stuff, right? So it's an island, for example, there's no drug epidemic. There's no meth epidemic. There's no oxycodone epidemic because illegal drugs are very severely penalized, but it's also an island that they can patrol with their Navy. So it's not real easy to get stuff onto the island. And if you are caught drug dealing, it's a life sentence. They don't have the death penalty in Cuba, by the way, because they have signed on to the United Nations Charter for Human Rights. So these are just some changes that I've seen over the years with Cuba, opening up of the economy. I've seen them go through some kind of good economic periods, bad economic periods. They follow the American elections very closely because the party of the president and the perspective of the president on the embargo has a lot to do with whether or not they're going to have enough to eat, whether they can make money and meet their needs or not. It really, I was there when Obama was reelected, the night he was reelected, and watching it in the hotel with the Cuban staff, and I had this epiphany that my job wasn't on the line regardless of who won that election, and my income wouldn't really change, probably not significantly, no matter who won the election. But there were people there who might not have jobs depending on the outcome of that election. And that was right, because if there's no more tourism and you work in a tourism hotel, you're out of luck, right? I took the very first night we arrived, I took the students to the top of the hotel where Hemingway used to live and where he wrote some of his works. And I've been there many, many times, stayed there many times, and never had it been closed. The restaurant on the top is still open, but it was dark. The hotel was dark. It's completely closed because that's right where the cruise ships used to come in, and there used to be a lot of tourism in there. There isn't right now. There's almost no tourism from the U.S., right? There's still tourism from Canada and other places, but none from the U.S. By the way, Canadians joke that they don't want the embargo to end because they like to have an island where they can go on vacation without Americans. That was the joke I learned when I was in Cuba this time. Okay, here's a trivia question for you. Last one, and we'll take questions after that. Every year, the General Assembly of the United Nations has a vote to condemn the U.S. embargo to Cuba. And each year, every country of the world votes against the U.S. embargo to Cuba, except for the U.S., obviously, and one other country. Can anybody name that country? Yes, Israel. Why Israel? Does Israel have a lot of potential business or not business with Cuba? Like, why Israel?
Israel's afraid to make the U.S. mad.
Yeah, because they're an ally. So it's kind of like you do something for me, I do something for you, right? That's the politics of it. Yeah, interesting. So again, Cuba has a long way to go. There's a lot of freedoms they don't have, but they've made amazing strides over the years that I've been there. And Cubans, when you talk to them, that we've talked to, and you say, well, what do you think about your government? Or how do you feel about your freedom of the press? Or what do you like or not like? And just like an American, they'll be like, well, I like these things, and I really don't like these things. If I asked you what you like or don't like about your government, I guess most of you could come up with a few things, right? So the only thing is Cubans might not be able to kind of stand on the street corner and yell it without fear of losing their job or some other kind of, or potentially being jailed depending on how prolific their spreading of that information was. So they don't have freedom of speech and press like we have.
I can give
Okay.
you a funny story about
Yeah.
that statue if you want.
Yes.
So,
Does that look familiar to anybody? Like they have one like kind of looks like that a little bit in Brazil, right?
yeah, but so that statue was built by Batista's wife. Batista got kidnapped by, as you would imagine, some folks who didn't want him to be in power anymore. And his wife prayed and promised God that if he was returned safely and if he lived, that she would dedicate Havana to Jesus Christ. She was going to build the biggest statue of Jesus Christ there ever was. And he got back, and so she was, okay, fine, we're going to do this. And she's like, I want a 90-meter tall statue. And they came back, they're like, oh, we fell 3 meters short. And she was like, oh, that's all right. You know what, 87 meters isn't bad. They go, well, 60 meters a hill, 27 a statue. And so she goes, so it's 87 with the hill. So you build a 27-meter statue of Jesus Christ. And they all said yeah. And apparently they didn't last very long after that. So yeah.
And the interesting thing was, it was literally the statue was put up, and within 3 days, I think it was 3 days later,
Yep.
The revolution with Castro came through, and her husband was put out of power again, permanently. Yeah. All right, questions?
Come on, anybody?
Yeah, let's start with Dan.
I don't have a
Professor
question,
Baraka.
but if anyone has a question, would you repeat it?
Yes, I will. Sure. What's your question?
So how difficult would it be to get to Cuba right now?
How difficult is it to get to Cuba? Well, I have put our travel agent on there. He's Swedish, so his name is Ivar at scannedamerica.com. There's his phone number. So Americans think it's really hard. It is not that hard. So there are still a number of categories that allow you to travel to Cuba under the current restrictions. It's just there's certain hotels you can't stay at because they're owned by the government. So there'll be certain places you're allowed to stay, certain places you're not allowed to stay. You need to use a travel agent that is approved by the U.S. State Department. That is one of the travel agents approved by the U.S. State Department. And that way they make sure that your travel falls within the regulations. So missionaries are always allowed to go. People with family there are always allowed to go. People doing research are always allowed to go. So there's, and research could be, I'm writing a book on a novel, I'm writing whatever. I've never once had anybody at customs on the way back in. Remember, this is not a restriction by Cuba on Americans, it's by America on Americans. I've never had anybody from the American government ask me why I was there or what I was doing. So these rules, by the way, exist on paper, but they're not really enforced. There has been discussion that they might be enforced, but so far they're not enforced. However, we wouldn't want you to flaunt the rules. So the important thing is to use a travel agent that is approved by the State Department, and they will create an itinerary and a trip that's consistent with the rules. I was there for my 50th birthday. I shouldn't brag about that. But in January, I took my dad and my kids. We went scuba diving in the Bay of Pigs. Saw sunken ships, by the way. It's amazing. So what I find is it's so close. It's not particularly expensive. It's a 2-hour flight from Atlanta direct. Like, my goodness, it's only 80 miles from Miami, right? So it's a very short flight. And if tourism was, if people perceived it to be completely open or the rules were promulgated to make it really easy or whatever, they'd be flooded, because it is the Spanish architecture and, very little crime, by the way, because especially crime against a tourist is very severely penalized because the government wants to make sure that people feel safe coming. So even more than a Cuban against Cuban crime against a tourist is almost unheard of, especially violent crime. And there's no guns on the island except for those with soldiers, right? It's not, talk about gun control, right? There's no like handguns, it's not open carry in Cuba. So again, lots of safety things there, but there are ways to go. It's really not that hard. Yeah, nice, thanks, selfie. Other questions? Yeah.
You guys mentioned about the community service and like the community centers that you have there. Do you think the essence of like gentrification and bringing these kind of like places into, I guess, more poverty-stricken areas will like cause that kind of like increases like rise, where people have the issue of being pushed out of their neighborhoods? Like, it is community-based, yes, but at the same time, like I'm assuming that it's gonna need people to work there and stuff like that.
So there's a little bit different as far as that concept goes, only because it's a little bit harder as far as buying houses and stuff like that. So it's not like you don't have it because it's a valid concern, right? But but the just because of the way the government is set up right now, it abates that a little bit because you're not really able to price people out of their own neighborhoods. It's not set up in that.
And the way that happens in the U.S. is when your property values go up, your taxes go up, right? So then people can't afford to pay the taxes even if the house is already paid off.
Okay, so it's not even.
They don't have the same kind of concept of property taxes that we do here. Yeah,
Now there are, I will say, so I was there for another week because my wife's Cuban, and so we went with my in-laws, and there are, like, we stayed in Old Havana, we stayed in kind of the metro area. There are varying great, like, even though, you talk about communism, you talk about some of the, the social, I don't say safety nets, but services and things, and kind of this equal playing field was the idea of communism. There are very different neighborhoods and very different, like, experiences as far as locals go. But it's people that are in those neighborhoods, they've been there for like 3-4 generations. Like, it's not.
Especially because you couldn't sell your property. So you didn't sell and
Yeah.
move, you stayed in it and like had kids and just built a new room or subdivided a room. So people did not move.
Yeah, like my father-in-law's house, that he grew up in is still there, and now 2 neighbors are living there, and it's 4 generations, 5 generations old. Like, it's not in a great area just because of how things are built up around it, but it's there. And so gentrification, I think, will eventually, if the government changes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's gonna happen.
Currently, it's less of a challenge. In fact, because the embargo, a shortage of building supplies and other things, so this is becoming, it's slower than it should be to kind of build up. And I should mention, we were there 1 week before the 500th anniversary of the city of Havana. So they were actually trying to spruce the city as much as they could because Obama was coming to visit, as was the King of Spain and a bunch of other foreign dignitaries. It got no press coverage that I saw in the U.S., none whatsoever. It was literally 1 week after we were there. It was going to be the party to celebrate the 500th anniversary because it's of the founding of the city of Havana by Columbus.
We left the night before that party.
Yeah.
Actually, we saw the fireworks the night before. They didn't announce them, so it just sounded like explosions and it rattled all over the buildings. But
all right, other questions? Let me get you that.
What's the language barrier normally like between Cubans and American tourists?
So what's the language barrier like? So Spanish is the language. Most of us, I can't claim to speak Spanish, but it's not hard to learn what I call walking around Spanish. Where in any language, in any culture you go to, you learn how to say hello and thank you and how much and where is the bathroom or the whatever you're looking for, the restaurant. But in general, in the tourist industry, most of the hotel people and other people will speak some Spanish, but it's really not that hard to communicate the basics of what you need. You can't sit down with an average person and have a detailed conversation because they're going to mostly speak Spanish and you mostly speak English. But overall, in the tourist industry, even with cabs, if you write down, question mark, how much to go here to there, you can get by. I think as tourism increases from the U.S., then they will have more English speaking. There are already tour guides there that speak Arabic or speak French or speak whatever as well as English. And if you have a tour guide, which is not expensive to have, they'll be very, very fluent. They have a great educational system. Other questions? Yeah.
So you said they're starting to incorporate internet and things like that in Cuba. Is there like a big push for internet, or is it
Oh yes, just like here.
like
Like, no, seriously, we want good internet, right? Yeah, how do we live without good internet? So they very quickly, once you realize what you've been missing, you very quickly want it. So literally on the bus, you can see that they're using GPS, or with our guide, it was like web streaming. YouTube is big because they don't have great TV there, so they YouTube. So yeah, there's a huge demand for it, and it's priced obviously cheaper than here, but the average income of Cubans is low. So the average Cuban can afford a phone and some kind of basic internet, but kind of like data roaming, that kind of stuff, a lot of folks can't afford it or can't afford much. So, but that is often true here too, right? People still have like flip phones or pay-as-you-go phones. So there's still a kind of a access in terms of economic access to the internet. But they do have libraries, and they do have kind of like internet cafes where you buy a card and pay by the hour, and it's very fast. So we didn't have, and when Americans go, the places that you go, the hotels you stay at, or the guest places you stay at, will pretty much have internet, and cafes and restaurants have internet. And I should mention, Airbnb's fastest growing market is Cuba. So Airbnb is huge in Cuba.
I will say, Facebook hit everybody at the same time, so everybody's got Facebook. Like 90-year-old ladies have Facebook, and like 10-year-olds have Facebook. Everybody's got Facebook. It's crazy. And everybody's doing it all the time. Like that's like, it took the place of like Twitter, Instagram, everything. Everybody on Facebook.
So this is new. This building was built, I think it kind of looks like the Statue of Liberty, which I take to be a rebellious statement, but I could have made that up. But this is right on the ocean in Havana, and it's one of the first really 5-star, very expensive, internationally built hotels. I think it was built by a Spanish company, and it's not full because now they built it assuming under the Obama administration tourism was opening, and then when it stopped opening, they've got some vacancy, but it's fancy, fancy, fancy if you're looking for a nice place to stay in Havana. And you can stay at internationally owned hotels. There's no rule against that. They're just expensive. The best, we didn't go to it because we couldn't fit it into the educational agenda. But Veradero is the area of beach resorts, kind of all-inclusive beach resorts. And it's about 2.5 hours by car outside of Havana. And incredible, snorkeling, scuba, gorgeous beaches, not very crowded, amazing. So if you do go to Cuba, I encourage you to try to enjoy a little bit of that while you're there. All right, other questions? You have one over? Yeah.
Yes. So one of the conceptions in America is that communism goes hand in hand with atheism, but a lot of these pictures that I'm seeing have things like statues of various saints and a lot of Catholic cathedrals. Is Catholicism a major cultural force in Cuba?
There's an element to that that is also the syncretism with Santeria, though, which
Yes.
is they've maintained.
Start back from like Spanish.
Yeah, I mean that to me, that's how that looks.
I'll have you do Santeria. So real quick, I don't know what time we're done, but probably about now. So the Spanish built cathedrals everywhere, and so that's for the architecture. There's not new Catholic church being built, and most of the churches are not real full. Under the Revolution, there really was people were afraid to go to church because they didn't want to, look like they weren't following the dogma. The Cubans don't want church. The Cuban government doesn't want church that's controlled by a foreign power. The Pope is a foreign power. So they do, but because when the Soviet Union collapsed, the government was so poor, they realized that the Catholics actually do a lot of charity and have all kinds of help for communities. So they rebuilt those bridges with the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is back involved and active in Cuba. But because there was like 2 generations where most people weren't going to church, the average, just like in the US, the average American at 25 years old is fairly secular, not super religious. There's some exceptions, right? That's about how Cuba is. So modern Cuba, there's some people who are religious. It's not as religious as it used to be. And then there's this kind of amalgamation of mixing Catholicism with religions from the slave trade that brought African and indigenous religions that then mixed with Catholicism and created some interesting variants that have taken root in Cuba.
So yeah, there's a big, like if you see really, really, really active religion in Cuba, the one thing that I saw over and over again, and once you can identify it, you see it everywhere. But Santeria, and you've heard of it. Everybody's heard of it, even if it's that dumb song. But the
I don't know the song. Sorry, but of course I
from,
will.
from yeah, it's but the it was a religion where like, and specifically Yoruba religions that came over with slavery, and then because they were forcing Catholicism on people they brought over, they underlaid it. So like they synced up different gods with different saints, different practices with the beads and the rosary, things like that. So you see people walking around in all white, you see people walking around with rosaries on, you see people walking around, like there's specific indicators, but they all mean something in that regard. And like you go to the airport after you realize that, and like 25% of the people coming in just all dressed in white, like, oh, you're from a different part of the world and you're coming here because this is like Cuba's considered like the hub of that particular faith. So a lot of the stuff has been maintained for a long time because of that particular kind of religious syncretism.
And even Catholics in Cuba, for example, if they had a bad breakup or they're having a bad relationship, they might go to the Santeria priest and ask for advice or ask for a cure, or, a potion or something to help. So it's kind of, you don't have to be one or the other, you can kind of do both. Other questions? I don't know what time we're out, I don't want to go over. Is this it? All right, well, thank you all for coming.